The contractor stood in the doorway and shook his head slowly, the kind of headshake that meant more than words ever could. "This house is beyond saving," he said, and behind him the walls seemed to lean in closer, as if listening. "Welcome back to the channel, everyone. If you love stories about second chances, hidden pasts, and the quiet courage it takes to rebuild something the world has already given up on, hit that like button, drop a comment, and subscribe, because today's story is one you won't forget." Let's get into it. Marisol Ferreira had signed the papers 3 weeks ago on a house nobody wanted, a crumbling Victorian on the edge of Willow Creek, with a sagging porch and windows boarded like closed eyes. She was 34, recently divorced, and carrying a kind of exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep. The kind that came from years of shrinking herself to fit someone else's expectations. When the real estate agent had shown her the listing, she'd almost laughed. The photos alone should have been a warning. Water stains bloomed across the ceiling like continents. The floor dipped in the hallway as if the house itself had given up standing straight. But something about it had pulled at her, some stubborn instinct she couldn't explain even to herself. Maybe it was the way the afternoon light still found its way through the grime on the windows. Maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe she needed something broken to fix, because she hadn't been able to fix herself. The contractor, a weathered man named Desmond Okafor, who'd been rebuilding houses in this county for 22 years, wasn't trying to discourage her. He was being honest. "Ma'am," he said, running his hand along a support beam that groaned under the pressure, "I've seen houses in bad shape. This one's got problems in the bones. Foundations shifted. There's rot behind that far wall you can smell before you see it. I'd be lying if I told you this was a weekend project." Marisol wrapped her arms around herself, standing in what used to be a dining room, now littered with old newspapers and the husks of dead insects. Somewhere above them, a loose shutter knocked against the house in rhythm with the wind, like something trying to get her attention. She had exactly enough savings to make this house livable, and not $1 more. There was no safety net beneath her, no family fortune to catch her if this failed. Just her, and a house that 3 previous buyers had walked away from without explanation. "What happened to the last owner?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. Desmond paused, and for a moment something flickered behind his eyes. Something that looked almost like reluctance. "Old woman, lived here alone the last 15 years, he said carefully. "Passed away back in March. Family never came to clear the place out. Just left everything exactly how it was." Marisol looked around the ruined dining room again, but this time she wasn't seeing decay. She was seeing questions, and she didn't yet know that the answers were waiting for her in the walls. Desmond left before noon, promising to send over a written estimate, though the tightness in his voice told her the number would be higher than she could afford. Marisol stayed behind anyway, wandering room to room with a flashlight because the electricity hadn't been turned on yet. Dust hung suspended in the beam of light like something frozen in time. The old woman's belongings were everywhere, untouched, as if she'd simply stepped out and never returned. A rocking chair angled toward a window, a stack of unopened mail on a side table, yellowed with age, a cardigan still draped over the back of a kitchen chair, sleeves slightly curled, like arms that had once reached for something. Marisol learned her name from a faded envelope, Eleanor Voss. She said it out loud, quietly, and the empty house seemed to absorb the sound without giving anything back. There was a strange intimacy in walking through a stranger's abandoned life, touching things that had mattered to someone else, wondering why no family had come to claim any of it. She told herself she was only assessing the property, deciding what could be salvaged before demolition began, but she found herself lingering in Eleanor's bedroom longer than necessary, studying the faded photographs pinned to a corkboard. A young woman in a factory uniform. A wedding photo, black and white, the groom's face slightly blurred, as if he'd moved at the wrong moment. A newspaper clipping about a local scholarship fund that no longer existed. Marisol didn't know why these fragments moved her the way they did. Maybe because Eleanor's life, like the house itself, seemed to have been quietly written off by everyone who should have cared. She thought about her own recent divorce, how her ex-husband's family had already begun referring to her in past tense, as though she'd become a chapter they'd closed rather than a person still standing in the room. She understood, in a way she hadn't expected to, what it might feel like to be forgotten while still breathing. In the back corner of the bedroom closet, behind a row of hanging dresses gone brittle with age, her flashlight caught the edge of something that didn't belong. A loose floorboard, slightly raised, as though it had been lifted and replaced many times over the years. Marisol knelt down, her knees protesting against the years, and pressed her fingers into the narrow gap. The board lifted with surprising ease. Underneath, nestled in a hollow space clearly built for this exact purpose, sat a metal box, rusted at the corners, and beside it, a leather journal, its cover cracked and soft with age. Her heart began to beat faster, not from fear, but from a feeling she hadn't experienced in longer than she could remember. Curiosity, sharp and alive. She lifted the journal first, careful with the fragile binding, and opened to a page near the middle. The handwriting was elegant, but shaky in places, clearly written over many years. The first line she read stopped her breath entirely. "If you have found this, then I am gone, and the house has finally let someone new inside." If you're already feeling pulled into Eleanor's story the way Marisol was, drop the word hidden in the comments below, because what she reads next changes everything she thought she knew about this house. Marisol sat back against the closet wall, the metal box heavy in her lap, and kept reading. The next lines were written in ink that had faded to a soft brown, but the words themselves still carried weight. "I bought this house in 1974, with money I was not supposed to have," Eleanor had written, "and for 40 years I have kept a secret. I was too afraid and too proud to tell anyone." Marisol turned the page slowly, aware of the strange privilege she'd been given, reading words meant for whoever came after, whoever the house chose to let in. Eleanor wrote about a man named Thomas Reyes, a co-worker at the textile factory, where she'd spent her 20s, standing at a loom 12 hours a day. Thomas had discovered that the factory owner was skimming wages from immigrant workers, falsifying hours, and threatening anyone who noticed. Eleanor had helped him gather proof, hiding documents in her lunch pail, copying ledger numbers onto scraps of paper when the foreman wasn't looking. It had been dangerous work, quiet rebellion dressed up as an ordinary factory girl doing her job. When the case finally went to the labor board, Thomas testified. Eleanor did not. She stayed anonymous, afraid of losing everything, afraid of her family's reputation, afraid in the specific way young women were taught to be afraid back then. The settlement money that eventually came, meant to compensate workers who'd been cheated, had included a portion earmarked for her, quietly, as thanks for evidence she'd provided but never publicly claimed. She had used part of it to buy this house. The rest, she'd never spent. "I told myself I would use it someday for something that mattered," Eleanor had written. "But the years kept passing, and I grew afraid of what people would think if they knew where money like that had come from, even though it was rightfully mine." Marisol opened the metal box next, her fingers trembling slightly. Inside, wrapped in cloth gone stiff with age, she found bundles of cash, older bills, and beneath them, a stack of documents. Property records. A handwritten will, unnotarized and possibly invalid, leaving everything to a scholarship fund for children of factory workers, the same fund referenced in the newspaper clipping Marisol had seen earlier. There was also a folded letter addressed simply to whoever finds this house worth saving. Marisol didn't open the letter yet. She sat with everything spread around her, the dust settling in the flashlight beam, and felt the shape of an impossible decision beginning to form. This money could fix the house. It could fix her entire situation, actually. Nobody knew it existed. The family who never came to clear out Eleanor's belongings certainly didn't know. Desmond didn't know. Nobody living had any claim to it except, perhaps, in law, herself, as the new owner of the property where it had been hidden. But Eleanor's own words sat heavy on the page beside her, something that mattered. A scholarship fund for children like the ones she'd once worked beside, exhausted and underpaid and unseen. Marisol closed her eyes, feeling the old house settle around her, the walls creaking softly like something exhaling after a very long-held breath. She realized, with quiet unease, that Eleanor hadn't just left her money, she'd left her a choice. And the kind of person Marisol became now would depend entirely on which way she chose to lean. Marisol didn't sleep well that night. Back in the cramped apartment she was still technically renting until the house became livable. She kept thinking about Eleanor, a woman who'd spent 4 decades sitting on a secret so heavy it had shaped the entire architecture of her quiet, solitary life. She wondered if that loose floorboard had haunted Eleanor every single day, or if eventually it had simply become part of the house, background noise beneath her feet. In the morning, she called her sister Priya, the only person she trusted enough to say any of this out loud to. Priya listened without interrupting, which was rare for her, and when Marisol finished, there was a long pause on the line. "You're seriously considering giving that money away," Priya finally said. Not unkindly, just disbelieving. Marisol admitted she didn't know yet. The money would solve everything. Repairs, her mortgage, the crushing anxiety that had followed her since the divorce, like a second shadow. But every time she imagined spending it, she saw Eleanor's handwriting, the specific ache in those words, something that mattered. She drove back to the house that afternoon, and this time, she opened the folded letter Eleanor had left unaddressed to any particular name. The handwriting here was different, less steady, clearly written much later in life, perhaps in Eleanor's final years. "I never found the courage to do what I knew was right," Eleanor had written. "Every year I told myself next year, until there were no more next years left to promise myself. I do not know who you are, the person reading this. I do not know what troubles brought you to this house, because I suspect only someone who needed saving would ever choose to save this place. But I am asking you, whoever you are, to finish what I could not." There was more. Details about the scholarship fund, contact information for a local historical society that had apparently tried to track down Eleanor decades ago for an oral history project on the factory strikes. Information that suggested Thomas Reyes had passed away in the 1990s. His own contribution to the case still unacknowledged publicly. Marisol sat on the bare floor of what would become her living room, surrounded by exposed beams and unfinished walls, and felt something shift inside her chest, some old rusted mechanism finally beginning to turn. She thought about her marriage, the years she'd spent making herself smaller so someone else could feel bigger, the quiet erosion of simply going along with things because confrontation felt too dangerous. She recognized something of herself in Eleanor's fear, and she didn't want to end her own life the way Eleanor had ended hers, sitting alone with an unfinished apology to the world. If you've ever felt like you were given a chance to do the harder, better thing, and you're wondering what Marisol will choose, type choice in the comments, because her decision is coming, and it's not the one most people would expect. She called the Historical Society the next morning. Then she called a lawyer, someone recommended by Priya, to ask what it would actually take to honor a decades-old, unnotarized will. It wouldn't be simple. It wouldn't be fast. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, Marisol felt like she was moving towards something instead of away from something, and that distinction, small as it seemed, felt like the beginning of an entirely different kind of life. The lawyer, a calm, unhurried woman named Renata Okonkwo Bright, explained that the unnotarized will held no formal legal power, but it did establish clear intent, and combined with Marisol's own testimony about how she'd found it, there was a legitimate path forward if Marisol chose to honor it voluntarily rather than fight the system to force it. "Nobody can make you do this," Renata said gently, sliding the documents back across her desk. "But you called me instead of a financial advisor, which tells me you already know what you want to do." Marisol laughed, a short, surprised sound, because it was true. Over the following weeks, something in Willow Creek began to shift, slowly, the way real change usually does. Marisol used a portion of the discovered funds, with Renata's careful legal guidance, to establish the Eleanor Voss and Thomas Reyes Memorial Scholarship, specifically for children of factory and warehouse workers pursuing their first year of higher education. The Historical Society, thrilled to finally have concrete details for their oral history project, helped locate Thomas Reyes's surviving daughter, a retired schoolteacher named Alba Reyes Whitfield, who wept quietly when Marisol explained everything over the phone, saying her father had spent his whole life wondering if anyone would ever know what he and a shy factory girl named Eleanor had risked. Desmond returned to finish his estimate, and when Marisol told him she'd found a way to fund the repairs herself, he studied her for a long moment before simply nodding, the kind of nod that carried respect rather than curiosity. He didn't ask where the money came from. Small towns had their own particular grace sometimes, an understanding that some questions were better left unasked. The renovation itself became a strange kind of ceremony. Marisol insisted on saving what could be saved: the original oak banister, the stained glass transom above the front door, even the rocking chair, which she had professionally restored rather than replaced. Desmond's crew uncovered more of the house's bones as they worked. Old newspapers used as insulation, a child's shoe wedged behind a wall from some renovation decades earlier. Small artifacts of all the lives this house had quietly held. Marisol found herself talking to Eleanor sometimes, alone in the half-finished rooms, thanking her, apologizing on her behalf to a version of history that had almost stayed buried. She wasn't naive about what she was doing. She knew grief counselors would call it processing, that some of what she felt for Eleanor was really unprocessed grief for her own marriage, her own silence, the years she'd spent choosing safety over truth. But she let herself feel it anyway, because for once, avoiding a feeling seemed like the more exhausting option. 6 months into the renovation, Alba came to visit the house in person, walking slowly through the rooms with her hand trailing along the walls, the way people do when a place means more to them than words can easily hold. She stopped in front of the restored rocking chair and told Marisol that her father used to say the bravest people were rarely the loudest ones. Eleanor never spoke publicly, Alba said, her voice thick, but she spoke through you, 60 years later, and honestly, that might be the loudest thing she ever did. By spring, the house on the edge of Willow Creek no longer looked like something beyond saving. The porch stood level again, freshly painted a soft, weathered blue that Marisol had chosen because it reminded her of the color in Eleanor's old wedding photograph. Sunlight moved freely through windows that had once been boarded shut, falling across floors that creaked with character now instead of collapse. Marisol stood on that porch on the day the first scholarship recipient was announced, a 19-year-old named Dario Espinoza, whose mother worked nights at a distribution warehouse 2 towns over. He didn't know the full story yet, only that some retired local teacher and a woman who'd bought an old fixer-upper had somehow made his tuition possible. Maybe someday she'd tell him everything. For now, it felt right to let the gesture simply exist, quietly, the way Eleanor's courage once had. Priya visited that weekend, walking through the finished rooms with quiet astonishment, running her hand over the restored banister, pausing at the small brass plaque Marisol had installed near the front door, engraved simply with 2 names, Eleanor Voss and Thomas Reyes. You know, Priya said eventually, you could have just fixed the house and kept the money, and nobody would have blamed you. Marisol thought about that, really thought about it, watching the late afternoon light spill gold across the porch boards. I would have blamed me, she said finally, and I think I'm done living like the version of myself who stays quiet just to keep things comfortable. She hadn't fully realized until she said it aloud how much this house, this strange inheritance of secrets and courage, had changed the shape of her own healing. She'd come here broken by a marriage that asked her to disappear a little more every year. She was leaving that chapter behind now, not because the house had magically fixed her, but because rebuilding it, board by board, secret by secret, had given her the practice of choosing herself, choosing truth, choosing the harder thing even when nobody was watching to applaud it. That evening, alone in her new living room with the rocking chair positioned by the window exactly where it used to sit, Marisol opened Eleanor's journal one final time and wrote her own entry on the last blank page, something she never imagined herself doing. She wrote about finding the floorboard, about the fear and the choice, about a stranger's 40-year silence finally becoming someone's education, someone's future. She wrote that houses remember the people who live bravely inside them, and sometimes, if you listen closely enough, they find a way to pass that bravery forward. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees lining Willow Creek, and the house, finally whole again, simply stood there in the fading light, holding its new story the same patient way it had once held its old one. If this story moved you, if you believe some houses really do carry the courage of the people who once lived in them, let us know in the comments, and if you're new here, consider subscribing, because there's always another story waiting, another quiet life worth remembering, right around the corner.